Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen, so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight, and I'm very happy to be here for the kickoff talk for Thrive. I think the topic was what was hard, was what made this kickoff a little bit of a bittersweet experience, because this isn't something that I can necessarily say is enjoyable to talk to families about. I think we've been in, as of recently, in this sort of influx of one tragedy after another with not a whole lot of time to rebound as people, let alone as families. So when Thrive approached me to talk about this topic, I knew it was something a little bit different for me to bring to families. I think just in past presentations, I like to interject some humor and maybe some interactive piece. And I found myself struggling, well, how do I do that with this topic? How do I make it funny? How do I make people have a good time? And I thought, like, if I'm struggling with how to talk to you about these conversations, then I know people are struggling to have these conversations at home. And so there was this sort of aha of this parallel process. This is hard for me to talk about other humans with. So we can have all the skills, is essentially. I'm going to go through the skills, and we're going to talk about sort of the tips and the life hacks of these conversations, but know that it's still hard, because there's still a lot of emotions behind these tragedies. And I think at our very best, just being with one another is kind of the biggest takeaway. So we'll get started. We have an agenda planned for tonight. Try to organize it, because that helps me. Intro, we did that. Thank you, Stephen. It's done. We can check that off. Nailed it. I'm going to give a little bit of a background info, not much, just to kind of contextualize why we're here tonight. I mean, I think it doesn't take much. We kind of all know. But it helps to give a little bit of information. And then, like, the real meat and potatoes of why we're here is the talk, right? It sounds kind of ominous, but talking about the conversation, right? How to talk to your children. When I say children, just to be clear, because I'll say it throughout, I really mean any minor, right? So we're talking age 2 to 18, right? Now kind of break it down by what it might look like at different developmental levels. But the talk is really essentially why we're here, the different skills and maybe the different approaches that one can take when trying to navigate these really hard topics. And I'll sort of wrap up with a little bit about maybe some other supports that can be looked for if you're noticing that maybe your child isn't doing well with just talking and at-home supports. If you're thinking to yourself, is something else going on? Is maybe talking not quite enough? Where you can maybe find some other resources. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a little time for some Q&A. So let's talk about a little bit of background info. So essentially what we're talking about tonight is traumatic events. We're talking about tragedies that have occurred in our nation, different types, right? Stephen kind of covered it. Mass shootings, school shootings, climate disasters, depictions of violence due to political turmoil, war, I mean, this is not new. I think we're really seeing more and more of it, and I think the accessibility to these images has gotten easier for our kids. But I mean, I think speaking for my generation, which I found out is elder millennial. I don't know how I feel about that, but it's not new. I mean, I still remember so vividly where I was when 9/11 happened and how emotionally affected I was by that, how emotionally affected my peers were, my family was. I think to this day, some 20 years later, my parents and I still talk about that day. So we're talking about trauma. We're talking about types of trauma, and it can be helpful to kind of break down the types of exposure one might have to trauma. So there's direct exposure and vicarious exposure. Mostly what we're going to be talking about tonight is vicarious exposure, but just to kind of know the difference, direct exposure is when one is really firsthand exposure. They're at the event and their life is in danger. They're experiencing a psychological or physical threat. So this would be the person who was, at the Twin Towers or in New York City at the time. Vicarious exposure, or it's sometimes referred to as secondary trauma or secondary exposure, is what kind of we're discussing today. It's when you witness the traumatic event in some kind of degree of removal, right? So either through a secondhand story, through a news report, through images that you see on social media. Secondary trauma is a frequent struggle that first-hand responders will have, right? People who are on the scene, therapists who work with trauma survivors, but it's not uncommon for folks who just have been exposed to a traumatic event, maybe on TV, and saw some graphic details, and it maybe hit them in a really sensitive way, or they had a previous trauma, and it sort of reignited some of those difficult feelings, which we will go into what that might look like. So when one is dealing with a vicarious exposure, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be traumatized. It has the potential, but it's an exposure that at least needs to be monitored, and that's why this talk is so important, right? When one is exposed to those images, to these stories, and then they don't have the proper safe place to process the feelings that come up from that exposure, then there is potential for some feelings and trauma-like responses to arise. And we will go more into detail what that might look like, but I want to have just a little bit of this isn't in any way digging on technology or smartphones. I love my phone. I look at it a lot. But I think this is part of why we're here today, right? These vicarious exposures, I think, as of recent, have so much to do with accessibility and smartphones and smart technology. And I think just the sort of direction that our media has gone, and the sort of sensationalization of storytelling in the media, right? It's got to be big, and it's got to be kind of scary, and it's got to get ratings, right? So I think even well-intended, sometimes we flip on the news, and it's a really scary story that a kid can be exposed to. But more than that, I think children have access to their own devices earlier and earlier. So a recent study showed that 53% of kids in the US have a smartphone of their very own by age 11. So if we're thinking about half, that means that their friends also have limited access to technology because they're hanging out and they're looking at their phones together, right? Another, I think, really important thing to think about, and I had a lot of trouble finding a consistent statistic on this, is the amount of drills that are happening in schools, right? So I remember when I was a kid, we did tornado drills, we did fire drills, maybe that was it. And then my senior year, we did our first lockdown drill, because it was right after Columbine. And I think now, in most schools, lockdown drills, and sometimes they're even referred to as school shooter drills, are more commonplace than ever in our children's schools. And that alone can conjure a vicarious trauma experience. So thinking about the way in which children experience these exposures in school, right? They have to be explained. Why are we doing these lockdown drills in school? And then also just remembering that kids talk to one another, and sometimes they're not necessarily the best historians. They may not necessarily give the most pertinent details of a media story, and they might choose to focus on the most sensational part of a story, right? Like maybe the most gory part of a story, or the most scary part of a story. And you've heard lots of, kids running home asking their parent, is this true that this happened? And you're kind of faced with that, like, where did you hear that? Sit down, let's talk about it, right? Like, so thinking about that too, that like stories are being passed around at school. So thinking about, obviously technology plays a part, but it's not, it's not the bad guy. We need it. We need it for our kids. I need it. But it certainly, I think, plays a big part in why we're seeing so much exposure recently. So going back a bit to what it can look like if your child is affected by vicarious exposure. There's a few things that you can be on the lookout for. Hypervigilance, so this sense of kind of always wanting to know what's around them, being very careful, a sense of hopelessness, rigidity or difficulty with change. I should mention some kids struggle with these things regularly. It's a difficulty. So these are things that you would notice as a difference from their sort of regular temperament. You may notice some inattention or focus troubles, avoidance, that can be school avoidance, avoiding difficult activities, even avoiding things that they used to love but no longer want to engage in. Noticing a uptick in anger, cynicism, or even apathy. Right? So some changes in mood. Sleep disturbances in either direction. So sleeping more than usual, sleeping less, right? Trouble falling asleep or waking. Remember, sometimes it's normal. You have a teenager and they're sleeping all the time. That's okay. And so you want to kind of keep things within context. Guilt and shame can be experienced. Sometimes undue guilt and shame. Separation anxiety, not wanting to be apart from their parent, caregiver, or sibling. Wanting to isolate from the world, not wanting to go out in public or into big public spaces. Conversely, particularly in older teen or tween age groups, you may notice some risk-taking behaviors. Trying their first cigarette, driving really fast. For younger kiddos, you may notice some reenactment in their play. You may see some of the violence that they witness in some of these traumatic events happening in their play. Chronic exhaustion, and then some somatic complaints. So, Mommy, I have a tummy ache, can't do that, or I have a headache, I don't want to go to school today. Right? So not necessarily able to communicate to you that there's some emotional distress going on, but instead it's playing out physically. So with that sort of context in mind, we can get into what the talk will be like. So I have like a bit of a cheat sheet, I guess, right? Like I like to break it down to make it somewhat organized, but I think that's a little bit of I'm misguiding you in that because it's not going to feel organized. It's not. But I think if you can take some of these tips and at least keep them with you, you will have like the skeletal structure of how to approach this, right? I think if you go in expecting like, okay, Laura gave me like the 1, 2, 3, so I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna hit number 1, and then my child will respond perfectly. And then I'm gonna hit number 2, and my child will say exactly what they're meant to say, and then I'm gonna be able to slide into number 3. That's not gonna happen, right? You kind of have to have like a few different, I was gonna say escape routes, but I don't think that's the right term for this, but a few different contingency plans is maybe a better term for that. So before we get into the talk though, I think it's important to remember to check in with yourself, right? Your job as the parent, the caregiver, teacher, coach, whatever your relationship is with a child, is to really listen. And I'm actually going to talk about how to listen, even though that sounds kind of silly. You're all like, I know how to listen. But to listen to your child while simultaneously providing a sense of comfort and safety. And that's not possible to do if you yourself are feeling unwell, if you yourself are sort of riddled with anxiety and fear. So you have to do this. I'm not sure how many here or at home are familiar with the movie Bad Boys. I could not show a clip because it is not appropriate. But we have our detective here who is very prone to anger outbursts, and his anger management therapist, woosah, just calm yourself, woosah. And he brings him to center. I don't know if woosah will work for everyone. I don't think it does. But you have to find what works for you, right? To bring you centered, to bring you into whatever sort of present moment you need to be in, to be there for your kids, right? And so you can ask yourself, am I okay to do this? And you're probably not. These are really terrible things that are happening, and we all feel lost in our own right. I know I feel incredibly scared about the future that my child may be, growing up in. But are we okay enough? And I think that's kind of the key word. Are you okay enough to have these conversations, right? And I think the balance to strike is, can you be there to listen? Can you be there to be fully present while also being open and honest enough with your own feelings should they arise during the conversation, right? You don't want to be at such a raw place that you wouldn't be able to contain your own feelings should they come up. Right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some emotional regulation tactics, how to kind of self-soothe. There's a handout that I have with a bunch of sort of tips and tricks for that. But this is a great way to start. You have to check in with yourself really before the talk can even start. So here's my cheat sheet. There's eight steps. They're not steps. That makes it sound too easy. I have my asterisk here to remind myself, to remind you, that what I really want about when we're going through this talk, and we go through, how to start the conversation, the normalization and non-judgment, is we'll really be talking specifically about, these experiences of vicarious exposure, right? Of these really scary world events and how to talk about them. But my goal is that when you walk away from this, you can use a lot of these tips and a lot of these strategies in any difficult conversation, right? Because we have a lot of them as parents, right? I think there are things that we all feel really strongly suited towards, that we have our, you know, like, as a parent, I got that. Anytime they bring it up, I got it, I feel very confident in that. And then there are things that just feel like a really hard, fast curveball. So things like, you know, conversations, the sex talk. These same strategies can be used towards those types of difficult conversations. Anytime that you feel like it just might be a hard conversation, like your kid might have a lot of emotion around a subject. These are all things that can be applicable or transferable, but certainly are important when we're talking about subject matter that deals with things that are a matter of life and death, right? Because that's what these tragic events really evoke in a lot of kids, is questions about life, death, safety. So let's go through it. So first, it's a matter of starting the conversation, right? So ideally, you would like to initiate the talk, right? We have well-intended plans, and so let's pretend that works out. And you get the opportunity to start the conversation. In order to do that, I recommend asking yourself a few things. So first, this kind of goes in line with what we were talking about with checking in with yourself, is asking yourself, is this a time and a place where I can be fully present? So, where are you? Are you at home? Are you at a restaurant? Is this a place where your kids feel safest? Is this a place where you feel calm? Is this a place where there will be lots of distractions, right? I mean, I think for the most part, maybe restaurants aren't always the best choice, because I think we've all been there where you're having a really intense conversation and the server comes up and asks if you want more bread, and it's just, conversation just goes right into the ground. So thinking about sort of like the pragmatics of where and when and how. So reminding yourself of the woo-saw, right? Is this the time and place where you can be fully present? Sometimes that's a matter of like, how much distance do you put in between when the event occurred and when you have the conversation? And this is a really tricky line to balance that you sort of need to intuit, because if it's something that is just so recent and raw, you may still be really raw. I know after what happened in Uvalde, Texas, I struggled a lot with that, and I needed time for myself. And I think if I had to talk to my child right away, it would have been difficult. It would have been hard for me to regulate my own emotions around fear and anger had I not given myself at least an hour or two to pay attention to how I was feeling, and give myself a little time to grieve and be angry, and talk to some friends and loved ones about what I was feeling. So making sure that you take care of that. And then also asking who should be present in the talk. So siblings, is it better to talk to your children one at a time? I think this is a good question to ask if you have two kids that are at sort of different developmental ages and might need things explained in different languaging, right? Or if you have kids who are maybe at the same age developmentally, but one might require a little more sensitivity around the subject. Or just, your kids are just gonna be fighting and goofing around if you do it together, and so it's just better to have them separate. At the same time, you may decide they would be each other's best supporters, so why not have them together? You may also call on grandparents or aunts and uncles to be a part of this conversation. So really thinking about who would be present as a supporter and who you may decide to opt out of the conversation in order to make the conversation a bit more not distracting or have a little bit more staying power. But we know that what we plan doesn't always happen, and sometimes these conversations happen spontaneously, right? You're in like the middle of Myers, and you're picking out, you know, like a can of kidney beans, and your child asks you, like, what would happen if a shooter came in the grocery store, Mommy? What do you say, right? Like that's, you can't finish your shopping, or can you? So I think the best sort of approach to this is first kind of checking in with what you know about your child. And where is this question coming from? What sort of need is behind the question? Is this a question that is really about fulfilling a need for comfort and assurance? Or is this a question that has more to do with curiosity, right? I think, you know, kids get super bored in the supermarket, so are they just asking about what happened because this bean aisle is boring, right? Or is it like, I'm scared, this is a big space and this is where the last shooting happened. Will you comfort me? So with that said, if you're really gauging that your child's anxious, they're needing comfort, that takes precedent, right? So beans down, cart down, you're having the conversation right there, right? And I think as parents and caregivers, we adapt. And it may not be the most ideal conversation, it may not be how you would have it at home, but you can at least have a conversation that provides your child with some sense of comfort. And then say, you know, I know this was a scary place to be, and why don't we talk a little bit more about this when we get home too? If you're sensing that they're really just kind of curious and there's not really any anxiety behind it, I think it would be perfectly acceptable to kind of move back up to a place where you can initiate the who, when, where, and just sort of respond with, I get it, yeah, that's confusing. And you know, when we finish grocery shopping, why don't we head home and we'll pick out a snack and we'll sit down and talk about it. Right? And hopefully they will agree. Right? All right, some other things about starting the conversation. So let's now say you're in your comfy spot that you've chosen, and it's your job to initiate, right? You can't just kind of sit there and look at your child and, no, you started this. You've got to sort of get the ball rolling. So we're going to do another little tricksy thing here to get your child talking, hopefully. And that's essentially not really invite them to come talk to you. We're not asking. We're setting an expectation to have this conversation, but it can be done in a really gentle and compassionate way, right? So you're getting the signal to talk even louder. Okay. So I'll let you kind of take a look at where your kiddo falls, and I'll read one as an example. So I'm going to read sort of the middle-aged example, where you might say something like, hey, come sit with me for a few. Let's talk a little bit about what happened yesterday. I have some things that I'd like to check in with you about, and then if you want to ask me anything, you can. And if not, we can be done, or you can always ask me later. And then here's like the perfect parent trick, right? Where you pretend you're giving them a choice. This feels so sneaky. But you're not, right? You're saying, do you want to get cookies or maybe some tea while we sit down and talk, right? You see how that's a little different from like, hey, will you come sit and talk with me? Because what are you going to get? No. I want to go play Minecraft. No. I gotta go call my friend. I have a FaceTime. So the trick here is to essentially say this is what we're doing, but in a very gentle and loving way, right? And it's an expectation. It's come sit with me. Period. Right? not a question. And I think the most important thing is it's nothing about this should sound punitive, right? So it's a very stark difference from these is you have to come and talk to me or no dessert tonight, right? Because I think sometimes when we get frustrated, that can be an easy go-to of like, if this conversation's happening or blank is off the table, right? We don't want these conversations to seem like a chore, right? And we'll talk about troubleshooting if we get some pushback a little later on. So the second part of these talks is to normalize your child's feelings, to normalize how they approach you, and to come at the whole conversation from a place of non-judgment. This is essentially what is going to get your child to keep coming back to these conversations. I think especially in older kiddos, as they're starting to understand social norms, they're always thinking, am I normal? I mean, heck, we're always thinking that, right? So a lot of times when these events happen, a big thought can be, is my response to this, are my emotions around what happened a normal response? I feel really angry about what happened. I feel really angry at the person who did that, but everybody else looks really sad. Is that normal that I feel angry and everybody else is sad? Right? So if you come in with an expectation of how they should feel, it's already going to be really an experience of being shut down. So you want to normalize any feeling that they might come to the table with, and not judge anything that they come to the table with that might not be something you expected. So again, take a look at what might be most kind of appropriate to you. I'll read another example. So for our littles, if they're little school-aged kids, you might say something like, I wanted to talk because what happened yesterday was really scary. And scary is a big feeling that lots of people have in their bodies and in their hearts. I know mommy felt it when she saw the news. Did you have any big feelings in your heart or your body when you heard about what happened? Right, so you're bringing them into the conversation. You're letting them know that it's a normal thing to feel big feelings, or so use different languaging for different age groups, but that anything they feel, right, for our teens, it's normal to feel almost any feeling under the sun when something like this happens. And then I think it's appropriate to show non-judgment by also sharing your feelings. That shows some vulnerability on your end too, right? If we're both here sharing our feelings, I'm not here to judge you, right? We're equals in this conversation. How to listen, right? I always picture sort of like the smart aleck teenagers being like, with your ears. Okay, yes, with your ears. But we're going to talk about really how to listen so that your kids stay seated with you and want to keep having conversations and stay engaged. So the first tip in this is just to make sure you're all on the same level. Physically, same plane, right? Like this would not work for the conversation. I am on a higher level than you. Symbolically, that's like a power thing that we would not want happening in these types of conversations. I think it can be super helpful to have, if you decide we're all gonna go in the living room, kind of let your kid lead and see where they sit. If they decide to sit, crisscross applesauce on the floor, faculty's willing, knees willing, like maybe that's what you all do. But if not, make sure you're all kind of on the same level, and that if you're sitting at the dining room table, even though stress, anxiety might, call you to pace back and forth while you're talking, that you kind of pull yourself back from doing that and sit at the same level with them, to show that you really are all participating. You've got a little bit of a night at the round table thing going. You're all equals in this conversation. It's also important to listen to verbals and nonverbals. I think a big piece of misinformation that sometimes parents, teachers, caregivers can fall into, a trap they can fall into, is thinking that eye contact means listening, and that's not always true. I think especially with emotionally charged conversations, and then also just depending on the child, eye contact can be overwhelming. Eye contact can be overstimulating. And so a child can actually do their best listening when they're breaking eye contact. And you have to know your child best to know when eye contact is a sign of listening and when maybe it's not. Additionally, I will always recommend that phones not be a part of these conversations, hands down. But that doesn't mean that you can't have other sort of fidgety, helpful devices or tools to keep hands busy. I think that can relieve some pressure. So if you have fidget tools, like, I was gonna say slime, but like I've come to sort of hate slime, and I think I'm done with it. But if you're still on board with slime in your house, you can take out the slime, but you can do, little Rubik's cubes. There's lots of those little blocks. You would want to be careful that they don't move too much into a distraction realm. So that's something that you would kind of use your judgment on as a parent, knowing like, okay, if we bring out Legos, that's when my son gets way into building mode, and it's not a fidget tool, it is a toy at that point. Okay? But then pay attention to it. I mean, is your child backing away while you're talking? Do you see them kind of glaze over? Are you losing them, right? Like, course correct. And we'll talk about ways that you can do that. And are they getting closer? I think that's something to pay attention to. Like, is your child getting closer, and maybe that's their way of showing that they might need a little physical touch during this conversation, and that maybe the languaging that they're needing isn't necessarily a verbal conversation, but they're needing some physical comfort. They're needing a hug. They're wanting to sit on your lap. So keeping in mind some of those things as how you listen to your child. Another crucial piece to listening is saying back what you hear. This is a great way to sort of check your understanding, and it's so validating for your child to hear you say what they said and say it right, and say it perfectly, right? They feel so seen, right? So you might say back to them, I heard you, it sounds like you've really been thinking about this a lot, and it's really frustrating to you because no one really seems to be doing anything to make it better. And I think if you've done this before with your kiddo, you sort of see that, like, yeah, that is what it's like. It just feels so validating to be seen. And then generally when they feel that sense of being seen and validated, you'll get more. You'll get more information. You'll get more of what's going on inside their head. And then part of listening is knowing how to ask the right questions based on what you're hearing. And you're asking questions that draw more out to listen to. You're not asking questions so that you can get your agenda across, which I think we've all kind of fallen into that trap before, right? But this is not necessarily the time for that. So a good example of kind of the difference between these two questions is a reflective question can be, will you tell me more about how that scares you? Or you can even not make it a question and just say, tell me more about how that scares you. I want to know. There's such a genuine curiosity, a compassionate curiosity in these questions that your child will feel from you. Versus a question like, well, don't you think if that happened, your daddy would protect you? Right? That just shuts down all the emotion that your child is trying to convey right there. Right? That's essentially telling your child that your fears are unfounded. Your feelings are wrong. Okay, sometimes with these talks we get asked really tough questions that we kind of are like, ooh, what? How do I answer that? These are the curveballs. So I pulled out a few of the hard questions that I know that I've gotten or helped parents through, but I know there's more. And so if you think of some, please bring them up in the Q&A. But I think one of the ones that comes up so frequently when children are exposed, especially for the first time, to scenes of death or violence, are questions about spirituality, questions about their own religious faith or concepts of God or the afterlife. Lots of questions like, did the people who die go to heaven? Did the shooter go to hell? Will the shooter go to hell? Or some older kids may really question their parents' faith. Like, how can you still believe in a God who lets these things happen? I don't want to go to church anymore, Mom. How can you believe this stuff? So when you're faced with these questions, it can be really tough because there's a strong chance that you may be wondering some of these same things too. Not always, but these really are sort of the types of events that are prone to bring up crises of faith. So when we're looking at these questions, I think it's important to kind of break it down to what your relationship is to the child. For people within the family, I think if you're a parent or a caregiver, you can talk to your child within sort of the context of what your family or cultural beliefs are, still not forgetting what we've talked about prior to this, the importance of normalizing their question, that these questions make so much sense to have. Right? I'm so glad you asked that, and it makes so much sense that you're wondering that. I mean, how can you not after something like this happened? I kind of wonder that too, and so you're not shutting down, right? Like, well, these are things that you just can't ask, because that will immediately create a barrier between you and your child. So making sure that you're remembering to normalize, to come in it with non-judgment, and then you can bring in your own family's belief systems or your culture's belief systems. And if your family doesn't really have a belief system, you can encourage your child to do some critical thinking. Maybe ask them what their values are and how it may align or misalign with some of what they're hearing other people talk about. For people who are outside of the family, this may be something that's a particularly sticky question to get because you don't know necessarily how to answer it in an appropriate way. So I think still normalizing the question is incredibly helpful and can validate the child's experience and feelings of confusion. And you can also encourage the child to bring the question to their family or a trusted loved one. And then if they express to you that that's not something they're able to do, you can encourage them to think a little bit on their own values or to think, do some critical thinking on how they think about things like the afterlife and God. And depending on your role, you can choose to share your own thoughts, but that's something that I think is always left to your own judgment. Other hard questions. We always get the questions that don't really have comforting answers, that don't have nice answers, that no matter what, they're scary. So a lot of questions, especially for younger kids that are maybe exposed to death for the first time, they may be asking about death a lot. That may sort of create this curiosity around death and this need to understand what death is. So things like, are you going to die? What will happen if you get shot? Who will take care of me? if both you and daddy die? So this is one of the, I think, trickiest lines to sort of balance, because it's important not to lie. It's important to stay honest with your children about the realities of life and death, while also providing comfort and assurance. So I think sometimes answering those questions with, everyone does die, but I plan to be here for a long time, and that's why I make sure I take my medicine every morning, and that's why I get up and I do my walks, right? You can remind them like things that you're doing to stay healthy and sort of redirect attention to the ways in which health and life are associated. I think it's also really important to remember that sometimes conversations around death, especially maybe with littles, they have a threshold. And answering too many questions about death, or even just kind of one, depending on where your child's emotional state is in that moment, can cause more anxiety, right? So if you're noticing, you kind of have this sort of inclination that if I answer this question, my child's just going to ruminate on this more, and I think they're going to be more anxious, and they're going to be thinking about it all night, because these questions always happen right before bed, right? So you don't have to answer all questions. You can do your best to sort of divert for the time being, right? Until maybe emotions are a little tampered down. And so that might be something, like I can tell that is a really confusing part of this for you, that's really scary. But right now, look at us, we're so happy, and I get to hug you so big, and we're gonna read a bedtime story, and then when we wake up tomorrow, we can talk a little bit more about this, okay? So it's a little bit of a diversion, and yes, we're kind of skirting around it, but it's important to recognize sort of how your answer might impact your child in that moment, and sometimes these questions, or these answers rather, might create a bit more anxiety. So kind of gauging what that might look like. And then we have questions that just don't have an answer. And questions like, will that ever happen here, right? We have this big hurricane happening in Florida right now, and I think it's got a lot of kids thinking about some of the weather, hurricanes here, but we've had tornadoes, we've had weather here. More philosophically based questions like, why do good things happen to bad people, or probably more accurately what I meant to write was, why do bad things happen to good people? And unless you're a philosophy major, you may not have an answer to that. And it's okay, you can say, I don't know, right? I wouldn't just say all right, good night. Like, you want to still come with empathy and normalize. Say, I don't know. That's a good question, and a lot of people wonder about that too. So it makes sense that you're wondering about it. Have you thought of any answers? Like, what do you think? So you can create a dialogue around that. If it's something like, will that ever happen here? I don't know. I don't know if that's ever going to happen here, but if it were to happen here, we have ways to be safe. We do. You can talk about the ways you can stay safe, right? So I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. I think that we all too soon, try to jump to fixing things or having all the right answers, and we don't need to do that, right? This is just sort of a little quick and dirty do's and don'ts, right? So important things to do while we're talking, while we're having this conversation, remembering to use concrete language, so that's like staying away from things like, rather than saying these people died, which is a very concrete way to understand they turned into angels or they went on their last journey, that can be really confusing for some kids. So really try to stick with concrete language. Try to share information in doses, right? So if a big event happened, you're not going to spend 20 minutes going into like the play-by-play of what happened. Remembering to take care of yourself, we reviewed that. My favorite advice from Mr. Rogers, talk about the helpers. That can be really assuring for children, is to remind them who the helpers are, right? Who they can look for, how brave the helpers are, like the firefighters, the paramedics, the therapists, all the people that are out there helping, and there's many more. That was just a shameless plug. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, right? And don't be afraid to share your feelings. And I think I've talked about this enough, where there's a fine line between sharing your feelings in the wusa way, right, where you're collected, and then, of course, you don't want to share your feelings where you're sort of falling apart in front of your child, and then they start to feel scared for you, and it turns into this reversal of your child sort of patting you on the back and saying it's going to be okay. You want to stay together, but it's a good way to model that, like, it's perfectly okay to share your feelings, even when your feelings are kind of scary. So don't go into graphic detail. There is no need. There's already enough of that, both probably from their friends and also in the media. Don't change the subject. I think if you're noticing yourself wanting to do that, that's a really clear sign that maybe you're not in the right space mentally to have this conversation quite yet. Don't be afraid to laugh or be silly. I think that there's always a place for an appropriate amount of humor or laughter, and that it can be a bit of both a break and it can be somewhat healing. Don't dismiss your child's concerns, even if they're disproportionate or even like a little bit unrealistic, right? So if your child says, I'm afraid a hurricane's gonna come to Illinois, it's not the time to have a weather lesson about why hurricanes. You can have that, I mean, I think that's important. They should know that stuff. But first, address their concern. They're scared, right? You talk about that they're safe here. Then when appropriate, talk about that hurricanes don't happen in Illinois. Don't feel the need to fix everything. You're there to listen. You're there to listen and you're there to comfort. These problems don't have solutions. You can't fix what's going on in the world. That was hard for me to say, but we can't right now. We can just be there for our kids. And lastly, don't put a time limit on the talk at the onset. I think if you're noticing that maybe your child's becoming overwhelmed or running out of steam, that might be an appropriate place to stop the talk. But at the start, don't say, okay, we have 15 minutes, we're gonna power through this, right? Just let it sort of happen organically. And that you can kind of be the judge to make the call, or if you notice your child is struggling. Okay, we're going to talk about how to end. I realize that I need to power through these last parts. So while you're ending, there's a couple things to remember while you're wrapping up this conversation. You want to check in for your child's understanding. This essentially just means you want to make sure that there's nothing left unsaid, and that there wasn't something that you said that maybe they didn't understand and you didn't give them a chance to ask for clarification. So kind of a catch-all statement, like we talked a lot about really important stuff, it was really hard stuff. Was there anything I said that you didn't understand? Anything you want to go over again? I'm probably going to say something similar at the end of this conversation with you, right? Is there anything we didn't cover that you want to talk about? It's a good way to sort of make sure they know that their voice is important in this. Make sure that you check in with your child's emotional state at the end. You don't want to leave your child sort of more raw and anxious at the end of the conversation than when you started. If your kiddo has a tough time identifying where they are emotionally, that's where the feelings handout can come in really handy. And they can point to where they are at in their emotional state. But you certainly want to make sure that emotion-wise, that they've experienced some relief. They're totally allowed to still feel angry, sad, even confused. The conversation should have at least brought some relief or comfort or closeness, and not made things worse. There's a picture of the feelings chart that's available up front for folks. Also remembering when you wrap up, show lots of gratitude and enthusiasm for your child. They showed up, they participated, that deserves some recognition. Acknowledge their participation, even if all they did was just go, yeah, I guess, right? They stayed there, they sat there with you, that's a win, right? And that kind of goes in line with the next piece. Being patient. This might be the start of something. You may plant a seed with this first conversation, and if all they said was like, okay, I guess, that may have just kind of been the invitation to start the next conversation. So it might not have felt like it went how you wanted, but it was still a success. And think about the next talk. This isn't necessarily the one and only. You can plan the next talk as a family. You can say, let's start having family meetings. Or they can be spontaneous. I know some families will have like little stuffies that they'll put up, like put it up on the mantle, and that means a family meeting has been called, right? For some kids that have trouble initiating or maybe aren't quite as verbal, you can have an anonymous notebook or question box. I like the notebook a lot because it's like kind of reliving a pen pal. And so you have a notebook somewhere in a common area. A child can write down their thoughts or questions. Then when they're away, a parent can write back their answers, their support, and then close it and put it, in the child's room. The child can read it and put it back in the common area. That way these things kind of have a buffer, especially if they're a little bit more emotionally sticky or tough. That's a great way to sort of create that communication without having the intensity of a talk every time, but keep the communication going. Some quick supplementals to the talk. Just two sort of behavioral things to keep in mind. Keeping structure in your environment. This was like one of the hardest things for me to think about after some of the more recent tragedies. It felt like doing regular stuff was pointless. Like going to work, going to get groceries, like why? But for children, this stuff is so incredibly important. Keeping to their regular routine, right? Making sure they make it to soccer practice, making sure that if they have a play date scheduled, they go to that play date. This may be interrupted if they're afraid, if they have reservations. Of course, you want to honor that and talk about it with them, but for the most part, you really do want to stick to what their normal routine looks like, what normal house rules look like, right? Like we're not letting up on house rules, we're keeping our sort of regular expectations of what, how the house operates. And then the last part is teaching and modeling self-regulation skills. This will be sort of a lifelong endeavor. So helping your children pay attention to their own feelings. You can do this first with prompting with your younger kids, like, hey, I see you balling up your fist. Do you think you might be feeling kind of angry right now? Helps them identify, helps them know, like, oh, yeah, I am very angry. They, of course, never say it that kindly, but it helps connect their emotions to any bodily sensations they're having, and then ultimately the idea being they will then know how to self-soothe that emotion, right? So that's where the grounding technique handout comes in to play, and you can use those both for yourself. You can do them together with your children, and really work on identifying when those super distressing emotions are impacting your child or yourself, and finding ways to calm them down before they become problematic. But sometimes they do, and I think it's important to, there's a picture of the handout. It's important to recognize that they do, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like if talking doesn't quite help. A little bit of troubleshooting, finally, is first, my kid doesn't really seem affected by this stuff. Like I'm looking out for what Laura told us to look out for, but they seem a-okay. And first, that's fine. I think kids have a lot of, when we talked about nonverbals, kids have a lot of other ways to process their emotions. They process their emotions through music, through art, through play, through their peers. And they may have processed their emotions in these ways. They may also be unaware of what's happening globally or nationally. So keep those things in mind. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't care. Another thing is my child won't talk to me about anything, let alone their feelings. And so a couple things is maybe first checking with your communication style. Are you maybe talking too much and not giving them the space to say their piece? Are you running into fix-it mode? And is this maybe an age where they're relying more on their peers? And then the last piece, which we'll run into just the last part of my presentation, is my child keeps saying they're fine, but I can tell they're not. And this is where we really might want to look in, could they use some extra support? There may be something else going on that's not related to some of what we're talking about with these exposure issues to these traumatic world events and feeling unsafe. But also, sometimes when you are exposed to these traumatic world events, you do start to experience a trauma response. And that can look a lot like depression, behavioral problems, anxiety, and just trauma, as though you were experienced to the event itself. So depression can look like frequent tearfulness, sleep problems, restlessness, eating too much, eating not enough, excessive guilt, thoughts of suicide, discussing suicide. Behavioral problems, you might see abrupt changes in behavior, like anger management issues, tantruming that feels regressive in nature. Again, these are all going to look a little different based on age. There are some academic problems that weren't there before. Defiance, misbehavior, talking back, that wasn't an issue before. Again, risk-taking behavior. With anxiety, you may see excessive worry about things that are seemingly unrelated to the events that they were exposed to. So worrying about, are we going to get there on time? Will my friends like me if I go to this party? Everything and anything. Irritability, always the snapping turtle. Muscle tension, sleep disturbances, maybe even panic attacks. And then trauma responses. So really intrusive thoughts that they just can't seem to shake. They're really troublesome. Nightmares, dissociative reactions, so sort of numbing out, zoning out, persistent negative beliefs about the world, that hypervigilance, or feeling extremely startled when hearing noises or being surprised. So what do you do if you're noticing these things and you think your child might need extra support? You can look at school for some assistance, you can look in your community, and you can look into some therapeutic supports. In the community, I would suggest looking at local organizations for the programs they offer. At school, this could be a whole other presentation. It's a pretty lengthy thing to go into, but first step would just be to go in and talk to your teacher or admin about accommodations. And then finally, when looking for therapeutic supports, you can look at websites based on, what kind of therapist you're looking for, what insurance you have, your zip code, and then some questions that you can ask the therapist to make sure that you're finding a good fit for your child. And with that, we're done. So. We have about 10 minutes, I think. Right? We end at 8:30?
Yeah. And then, yes, we'll do some questions, and I think our executive director, Jenny, is going to make a comment or two about Thrive. Am I right on that?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, are there any questions from people?
Yeah. Can you explain why sometimes you have a behavioral outburst? Like, why is that sometimes the response that a child has?
Sure. Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with just where their verbal ability is at. It has a lot to do with temperament to begin with. So I think it's just based on your child's unique personality. But I think it also, verbal ability plays a bit into it, and emotional, I think, languaging, right? So sometimes your child may not have the ability to know that funky feeling in their stomach and that hot sort of flush feeling and that like weird sort of like rush that we get when we feel embarrassed is embarrassment. And instead it just feels yucky and wrong. And so the only thing to do then is to just react. And so it's an issue of maybe not having the ability to recognize the emotion, to verbalize the emotion, and not having a skill set around addressing the emotion. So it can be like an issue of just lack of skills. Right? So, and some of that is just developmentally. Their kids aren't able to do that up until a certain age. I mean, the kids tantrum for a reason. Terrible twos, which is a total misnomer because they happen before then, they happen after then. It's such a unique, timeline. But it's really just an issue of there's only, so much that a child can understand about their body in a verbal level that some of it, like, it comes out in the only language they know at first, which is their body. Just kicking and screaming, and that's their communication style. It's their first communication, so it's how they came out. Kicking and screaming, right?
What are your recommendations for including extended family members in the discussion? Because I can know that grandparents may be sitting there telling the child, if you go to school, you're going to die, and the parents are trying to work.
Sure.
We've been talking about
Yeah.
your thoughts of including extended family to get on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you can get extended family to be on the same page, that's a great thing. When is the operative word? I think the best sort of way for parents to approach that is maybe to first have a sit down with, if they're having trouble with, whatever, grandparents, their siblings, so aunts and uncles, who are, maybe not on purpose, sort of contradicting what they're trying to do with their child. Sit down with them first and explain the reasoning about this is why we're having them go to swim practice, this is why we're having them, and then if they're still not on board and making things more difficult for the child, because having sort of contradictory messaging from different family members can be so extremely confusing for the child. It's really then a difficult decision for parents if you can't get your extended family to be on the same wavelength and to be in the same corner to support your child's behaviors. So then it's a question of every time we see, this example, our grandparents, do we do some corrective work after the fact? Or do we then make a decision to see grandma and grandpa less often? And both are really difficult decisions to make. Ideally, you would want to have them in your corner, and maybe family therapy would be a great choice in that regard, if you can get everybody in the room together.
Thanks.
I remember for 9/11, I was in high school and going from classroom to classroom, how the teachers responded differently.
Yeah.
And I remember the classes where the teachers had the news on, and then the ones where the teachers decided to not even acknowledge that it was happening and just teach like normal. And so that was a long time ago, and there's a lot more education, I assume, around how to speak to children around this.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any sense of how well schools are educating teachers around these topics.
I don't. I think it's so varied, is why I don't. I think that's just a nationwide issue we have with school curriculum as well, is that there's such a varied discrepancies in how schools handle everything, and what schools have mental health resources and what schools don't. I think in general, it's ideally, the balance to strike would be is you certainly shouldn't ignore these events while they're happening, because certainly nowadays, children know they're happening usually before the teachers do, because they're looking at their phones. So to have a teacher ignore that it's happening is really scary for the kids, because they're wondering like, okay, well, what's going on? I know this happened, but I don't have any updates. But then to have sort of nonstop streaming footage without processing the violent images that are happening, you don't know if that child feels safe in that environment. They could be surrounded by a teacher they don't feel safe around, other students they don't feel safe with, and then to see those images without really being able to talk about them, they could start to have trauma responses in the classroom with no one there to notice or check in on them. So I think the balance to strike would be to keep children informed without necessarily streaming sort of consistent visual, bombardment of traumatic imagery. I think like updating even just sort of verbally would be like the more ideal situation. And I don't know what schools are doing, truth be told, but like if principals or someone on the PA could update, or teachers could sort of be given like, okay, now you can tell your students this, and guidance counselors can be made available. That would be sort of students who want to go home can. Those things would be, I think, most ideal.
What would be your recommendation, like initial, for helping somebody bring down the hypervigilance after because like you said, more and more events keep happening. There's not a lot of time to process and even come down.
Yeah.
So what would be your recommendation for taking that edge off that hypervigilance?
Yeah. So the hypervigilance is such a body-based experience that like your mind then follows, right? So you're really keyed up physically first, right? Like your body is in like mode, and then your brain is saying like, somebody's gonna come in that door, what was that sound? And so the first step would be for your body to calm itself first, and then thoughts will follow. And so grounding techniques are really the best sort of way. So you'd be able to sit with someone, and maybe if they're not capable of bringing themselves down quite yet. There's a lot of different grounding techniques that can calm the body, calm the nervous system. I think trying to refocus the mind. You want to make sure that you're picking grounding techniques that don't make the person feel more in danger. The person who's feeling hypervigilant, you don't want to ask them to do a meditation with you and have them close their eyes, right? That's going to feel really dangerous. So eyes open, maybe facing like the openness of the room, but you can have them maybe run their hands under some water, go for a walk with you in a sort of contained space, like a yard or a track. If it's a kiddo, you can go on some swings. The movement of swings can be calming for the nervous system. There's a few ways to sort of bring that body anxiety down, and that's then when like the conversation to process. Can you tell me what you were feeling scared of? That's interesting, because, that's not really something that we've talked about before. Like, will you tell me how often you're feeling? That's when the conversation can really happen once the body's at like baseline. Because when they're keyed up, they're feeling really like, I gotta look out for any
The time
threat.
is now 8:30.
That's
The
not a
library will close
conversation.
in
The
30 minutes.
conversation won't be heard, it's gonna go right over the, so.
Well, I think we probably do need to wind
Yeah.
up. I think that announcement was letting us know something about the
Okay.
library. Thank you so much.